Why American soldiers killed their own officers in the Vietnam War. The dark side of fragging. The Vietnam War, spanning from 1955 to 1975, was a conflict marked by intense controversy, brutal combat, and deep divisions both within the United States and among its troops in the field. Among the many disturbing aspects of the war was the phenomenon of fragging, a term that became synonymous with the deliberate killing of military officers and non-commissioned officers by their own men. This deadly practice, carried out primarily with fragmentation grenades, was a shockingly common occurrence during the Vietnam War, with estimates of hundreds of such incidents leading to the deaths and injuries of numerous US military personnel. The question arises, why did American soldiers resort to killing their own officers? The answer is complex, rooted in the unique circumstances of the Vietnam War, the morale and mindset of the troops, and the broader social and political context of the era. Fragging became a term of infamy during the Vietnam War, but the concept of soldiers rebelling against their superiors is as old as warfare itself. What made Vietnam different was the scale and frequency of these incidents, as well as the specific conditions that fostered such extreme actions. The Vietnam War was a deeply unpopular conflict, not just among the American public, but also among many of the soldiers who were sent to fight it. Unlike previous wars, where soldiers often volunteered out of a sense of duty or patriotism, a significant portion of the US military in Vietnam was composed of draftees, young men conscripted against their will, many of whom did not believe in the war they were being asked to fight. The draft itself was a source of deep resentment. Out of the 27 million American men eligible for the draft during the Vietnam War, 2.2 million were conscripted. Although only 25% of the US military was made up of draftees, the draft had a profound impact on morale and cohesion within the ranks. Many of those who were drafted came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, as wealthier and more educated individuals often found ways to avoid conscription, either through deferments, medical exemptions, or by fleeing to Canada. This disparity created a sense of injustice and alienation among those who were forced to serve, and it contributed to the overall disillusionment with the war. For many soldiers in Vietnam, the war was not about defending freedom or fighting communism, as the US government often framed it, but rather about survival. The brutal reality of combat, the ever-present threat of death or injury, and the lack of clear objectives all combined to erode morale. Soldiers found themselves in a hostile environment, fighting an enemy that used guerrilla tactics and seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The dense jungles of Vietnam were filled with deadly traps, ambushes, and the constant threat of sniper fire. This type of warfare, coupled with the perception that the US was making little progress, led many soldiers to question the purpose of their mission. The lack of clear military objectives in Vietnam only compounded the sense of frustration. Unlike World War II, where the goal was to defeat the Axis powers and liberate occupied territories, the Vietnam War was a conflict without a clear endgame. The US military's strategy was based on attrition, wearing down the enemy through continuous combat and inflicting heavy casualties. However, this strategy did not translate into visible progress, and the ambiguous nature of the war led to widespread cynicism among the troops. Soldiers began to see their involvement in Vietnam as futile, and many felt that their lives were being wasted for a cause that even their leaders seemed unsure about. This disillusionment with the war was exacerbated by the nature of the US military's leadership in Vietnam. The American military hierarchy was often seen as detached and out of touch with the realities on the ground. Officers, particularly those who were career military, were sometimes perceived as being more concerned with their own promotions and accolades than with the welfare of the men under their command. This perception was fueled by the military's body count strategy, where success was measured by the number of enemy combatants killed rather than by strategic gains. Officers were pressured to produce high body counts, leading some to make reckless decisions that put their men in unnecessary danger. The lack of trust between officers and enlisted men was a significant factor in the rise of fragging. In many cases, soldiers viewed their officers as incompetent or indifferent to their safety, and this resentment often boiled over into violence. The hierarchical nature of the military, where orders were to be followed without question, only intensified the tension. In a war where survival often depended on quick thinking and adaptability, rigid adherence to orders from superiors who were perceived as out of touch could be a matter of life and death. One of the most infamous incidents of fragging occurred after the assault on Hamburger Hill in May 1969. The battle, fought over 10 days for control of a 3,000-foot hill in South Vietnam, was one of the bloodiest of the war. After suffering heavy casualties, American forces eventually captured the hill, only to abandon it days later. This decision led to widespread outrage among the troops, who saw it as a senseless waste of lives. In the aftermath, an underground GI newspaper placed a $10,000 bounty on the head of Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, the officer who had ordered the attack. Although Honeycutt survived multiple assassination attempts, the incident highlighted the deep animosity between the rank-and-file soldiers and their commanding officers. The fragging of officers was not only a response to perceived incompetence or recklessness, but also a means of self-preservation. As the war dragged on and the US began its gradual withdrawal, soldiers who were nearing the end of their tours of duty became increasingly focused on surviving long enough to go home. Officers who were seen as overly aggressive or too eager to engage the enemy were viewed as threats to this goal. In some cases, fragging was used as a warning to officers to back off and avoid putting their men in unnecessary danger. The psychological toll of the Vietnam War cannot be overstated. Soldiers were subjected to extreme stress, not only from the dangers of combat, but also from the conditions they faced in the field. The tropical climate, with its oppressive heat and humidity, was a breeding ground for diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and fungal infections. The constant presence of death, whether from enemy fire or the inhospitable environment, weighed heavily on the minds of the troops. Many turned to drugs and alcohol as a means of coping with the horrors of war. It is estimated that up to 20% of US soldiers in Vietnam used marijuana, and heroin addiction became a significant problem in some units. The availability of drugs, combined with the stress of combat, created a volatile environment where tensions could easily escalate into violence. Racial tensions within the US military also played a role in the phenomenon of fragging. The Vietnam War occurred during a time of significant social upheaval in the United States, with the civil rights movement challenging the status quo and exposing deep-seated racial inequalities. These tensions were reflected in the military, where African American soldiers often faced discrimination and unequal treatment. In some cases, fragging was motivated by racial animosity, with black soldiers targeting white officers who they believed were treating them unfairly. The case of Billy Dean Smith, an African American private accused of fragging 2 white officers in 1971, is one such example. Although Smith was ultimately acquitted, the incident highlighted the racial tensions that were simmering within the ranks. The widespread use of drugs among American soldiers in Vietnam further exacerbated the problem of fragging. Drugs like marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamines were readily available, often purchased on the black market. Some soldiers used drugs to escape the horrors of war, while others used them as a means of coping with the stress and boredom of life in the field. However, drug use also led to increased tensions between soldiers and their officers, particularly when officers attempted to crack down on drug use within their units. In some cases, officers who enforced strict anti-drug policies became targets for fragging, as soldiers sought to protect their access to drugs. The US military's response to the problem of fragging was largely reactive. As incidents of fragging increased, particularly between 1969 and 1971, the military implemented measures to reduce access to grenades and other weapons that could be used for fragging. In May 1971, the US Army temporarily stopped issuing grenades to all units in Vietnam and conducted searches to confiscate unauthorized weapons. These measures, however, were only partially effective. Soldiers determined to carry out fragging attacks could still obtain weapons through the black market or other means. The consequences of fragging extended beyond the immediate loss of life. The threat of fragging created a climate of fear and mistrust within the US military, further eroding the already fragile morale of the troops. Officers who feared being fragged were often reluctant to enforce discipline or take decisive action, leading to a breakdown in military order. This lack of discipline, in turn, contributed to the overall decline in combat effectiveness, as units became more focused on self-preservation than on carrying out their missions. The phenomenon of fragging had a lasting impact on the US military and its approach to leadership and morale. The Vietnam War exposed the deep flaws in the draft system, the military's leadership structure, and the overall strategy of the war. In the years following the conflict, the US military made significant changes in an effort to prevent a recurrence of the problems that had plagued the Vietnam War. One of the most significant changes was the transition to an all-volunteer force, which was implemented in 1973. By eliminating the draft, the military sought to build a force composed of individuals who had willingly chosen to serve, rather than those who had been conscripted against their will. This shift was intended to improve morale, cohesion, and overall effectiveness. The legacy of fragging also influenced the way the military approached leadership training. In the wake of the Vietnam War, there was a renewed emphasis on leadership development, with a focus on building trust and communication between officers and enlisted men. The military recognized that effective leadership was not just about issuing orders, but also about understanding the needs and concerns of the troops. This shift in leadership philosophy aimed to prevent the kind of resentment and mistrust that had led to fragging in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a conflict that left deep scars on the American psyche, both for those who fought in it and for the nation as a whole. Fragging, as a manifestation of the disillusionment and anger that many soldiers felt, serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war. It was a phenomenon born out of desperation, fear, and a sense of betrayal. Soldiers who felt abandoned by their leaders and by their country, fighting a war that many believed was unwinnable and unjust. Today, the term fragging is a dark chapter in military history, a symbol of the breakdown in discipline and morale that can occur when soldiers lose faith in their mission and their leaders. While the Vietnam War is long over, the lessons learned from fragging continue to shape military policies and practices, reminding us of the importance of leadership, communication, and the welfare of the men and women who serve in the armed forces. The tragedy of fragging underscores the need for a military that not only prepares its soldiers for the physical demands of combat, but also supports them mentally and emotionally, ensuring that they never feel so desperate or disconnected that they see their own comrades as the enemy.